Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome each of you to our fifth and final webinar in our CMMC series. Even though this is our final live webinar, I encourage all of you to register and view CMMC-related content on L3Harris's NeoSMRT portal. You will find recordings of all 5 webinars, a self-assessment tool, and additional resources related to CMMC. If you're an L3Harris supplier, we highly encourage you to register and complete the self-assessment. Over the coming months, you will receive a survey from L3Harris requesting you provide information on submission status for NIST 800-171 self-assessment compliance and SPRS. We are diligently working to update procurement and subcontracts documents and flow these requirements down to all our suppliers. Now it's time to learn about how to prepare for a CMMC audit. Ed and Neal, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Let me get the slides up on the screen here 1 second. We'll start with a quick introduction of the speakers today. I'm Ed Bassett. I'm the Chief Security Officer for NeoSystems Corporation. Also joining me today is Neal Beggan, a Principal for Risk Assurance and Advisory Services with Cherry Bekaert. He is one of the handful of trained provisional assessors. So we'll be talking in detail about the assessment process. And then from L3Harris to answer questions during and at the end of the presentation, we have Jeff Baldwin, Jeff Trinidad, Joseph Polvino. So I want to thank you all for joining today. Today we are going to take, as Jeff said, a deep dive into the assessment process, what it takes to prepare for, successfully pass a CMMC assessment audit. Quickly for context, this is the fifth webinar in the series that L3Harris has sponsored. The first 4 include the fundamentals of CMMC, deep dive on level 1, level 3, as well as a deep dive on levels 4 and 5. Those were live on the dates shown on the screen, but they can be seen on the NeoSMRT portal in an on-demand format. So I want to encourage you to go there. If you don't have access today to the NeoSMRT portal, I will have some slides near the end where we'll talk about how to get an invitation and get access to that portal. But it's designed as a resource for L3Harris suppliers, as well as a way for you to report some of the status information that Jeff was mentioning earlier. So we'll start with looking at the role of the assessment in the certification process for CMMC. The diagram on the right is a diagram from the CMMC Accreditation Body. The CMMC Accreditation Body is the official organization that's authorized to give out certifications under the CMMC framework. And they've published this 10-step process, of which steps 7 and 8 are the actual conduct of an assessment by a certified third-party assessment organization. And number 8 is an allowance of up to 90 days to remediate findings. So the assessment process, as well as the reaction, the follow-up to that process, will be covered here today. Prior to that, the steps 1 through 6 include all the preparatory items that we've covered in some of the previous webinars. And then steps 9 and 10 are the actual issuance of your certification by the CMMC Accreditation Body, which, as it notes there on the slide, is good for 3 years from the time it's issued. So every certification under CMMC does require this independent third-party assessment. It has to be performed by 1 or more certified assessors. These are individuals that have gone through training and certification, and they must be affiliated with a certified third-party assessment organization, or C3PAO. We'll talk about quite a bit in our presentation today. As noted, if there are some findings in the assessment, there is a 90-day period after the end of the assessment in which they can be resolved. If resolution takes longer than that, then a new assessment is required, and we'll talk in some detail about how that might work when we get into the details of the assessment process. And in order to get a certification from the CMMC Accreditation Body, it is necessary for that C3PAO to submit a successful report, meaning a report where they recommend certification to the CMMC AB. The final decision is still made by the accreditation body, but is a prerequisite to have that assessment submitted with a recommendation to certify. CMMC Accreditation Body website link is on the screen. They have some good information published about their standards, practices, processes. They are not a policy-making body. They are getting policy from the Department of Defense, but they have a MOU and a contract with the DoD to translate those requirements into practices and carry this out on behalf of the DoD. Today, they are the only organization that's authorized to provide CMMC certifications. So today we're going to talk about preparing for a successful assessment and then what to expect from the assessment process. Neal, anything you want to add at this point?
No, just that, I think you summed it up well. This webcast is more focused on the assessment itself, and it's really kind of going under the assumption that proper readiness has already occurred really in those steps 1 through 6. We'll touch on some of that, but really the focus today was what to expect from an assessment and really kind of dig in on some of those hot button items if findings are actually discovered during the course of assessment, how those are handled, and then any potential dispute resolution that's needed. So happy to jump right into it.
Thanks. And as for the audience, as we do go through this today, if you have questions, please do submit those in the attendee question box on the webcast platform. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 folks from L3Harris that can answer L3Harris specific items, and Neal and I will try to answer questions about the assessment process. Before we dive into the details, I want to start with a quick audience poll. So I'll cue our producer to put the poll up for the audience. All right, we'll leave the poll up for a minute or two, so please do send your answers back in the webcast platform, and we'll move on to the next slide and get things started. And then as we get some results there, I'll discuss those results with folks on the call today. So the first piece is finding and selecting C3PAO. C3PAO, as I mentioned, is necessary for doing the assessment. No other parties are allowed to perform a formal assessment and submit that. So it is necessary to go out and look for someone who has that certification. As CMMC is new, there are today no CMMCs actually certified by the accreditation body, but that process is moving along quickly. And Neal, maybe you can give us a little bit of idea of where we are with respect to getting the CMMCs authorized and on the marketplace. We do have on the slide the link to the marketplace published by the CMMCAB. This went live just a few days ago, late last week. But as of today, there's no C3PO. So Neal, can you give us an idea of how that process is moving forward and when we can expect to see some C3POs there?
Sure. So what they are currently doing, they've enacted what's called a provisional period where they selected individuals, roughly, you can see down in kind of the third section here, upwards of 100 individuals to become what are called provisional assessors. Those folks are then aligned with a C3PAO. It could be an organization that they work for, it could be an organization that they own, or it could be an independent contractor aligning with another C3PAO. As Ed mentioned, as of this morning, the marketplace, while it did go live just a few days ago, still does not have any C3PAOs listed, and there's a reason for that. You can see kind of in this first section here, working down these bullets, the C3PAOs themselves have to be certified to level 3 of CMMC in order to conduct assessments, even in the provisional period. Not only that, we are required to sign a professional code of conduct, and also will eventually need to meet an ISO 17021 certification status ourselves. So there has been some thought going into kind of the cobbler shoes, to use that analogy, in terms of the folks that will actually be doing these assessments. Where we are currently is there are, as I mentioned, 100 individuals, roughly give or take, that have gone through the provisional period. That probably equates to closer to about 75 C3PAOs that will go through the certification process. Last I heard, upwards of the initial batch of 25 have been accepted by the DoD, and what that means now is that they in turn will go through their own DBCAC assessment to obtain CMMC level 3 status by the DCMA. So they will be audited themselves, or excuse me, assess themselves against level 3, and then once they are approved, they will be able to conduct provisional assessments. Hopefully, Ed, that shed a little light there.
It is important that the C3PAO that you choose to do your assessment is independent. And those independence rules require that they have not done any consulting work for the companies that they are doing assessments for. So while many of the C3PAOs may offer consulting services, they can't offer those services to the same customers that they're doing CMMC certification assessments to.
Yep.
So I think as you look at selecting your C3PAO, that definitely has to be someone that's independent and different from the folks that you've used to help in the preparatory activities, getting ready for the C3PAO. Neal, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that C3PAOs typically do other than the formal assessments that may be part of their service mix?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can kind of paint this with the brush from Cherry Bekaert's perspective. As Ed mentioned, there has to be an absolute line in the sand between what the CMMC, the accreditation body, considers consulting versus the assessment itself. So any prep work, as Ed mentioned, kind of disqualifies you, if you want to use that term, from being able to conduct an actual assessment. So any of the folks on the call that have been working with organizations will need to source another C3PAO when it comes down to the assessment itself. However, it's not uncommon. There was some confusion that I learned recently that a C3PAO cannot help other organizations with consulting, and that is not true. So for example, Cherry Bekaert, we are both in process of becoming what's called an RPO, a registered practitioner organization, which is really designed to help companies prepare for a CMMC assessment, but we are simultaneously becoming a C3PAO in order to conduct these third-party assessments. We just can't do it for the same client. So outside of that, what you're going to see, a lot of the folks that make up the C3PAO population, they could be public accounting and consulting firms, much like Cherry Bekaert. They could be IT security firms. Some of the other practice areas typically are going to involve other adjacent IT compliance areas such as ISO, CMMI, PCI, other NIST-based standards, and of course the ever popular SOC, the SOC audits.
Good. And then the last item on the slide is noting that the provisional assessments are expected to concentrate on CMMC level 1, but may later expand out to level 3. And I want to tie that back into the poll questions. We were asking about CMMC level that you're targeting. 72% of the attendees today said level 3, 16% said not yet determined, and only 10% said level 1. And there were no votes for level 4 and 5, and only 1 vote for level 2. So that is not unusual of what we're seeing, that the majority of the focus has been on level 3, because that's the level at which you can store and process controlled unclassified information. So that's, as we think about the typical assessment, I think the idea that this will start with level 1 and expand to level 3, it may get to level 3 sooner than folks are anticipating, because that's where the majority of the interest is, and that's where that's where some of our focus will be today as we talk through the details of the assessment process.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't know how that poll could have been done any more accurately to depict kind of what is assumed to be the population of folks to go through the various levels. So that's interesting. It's probably spot on where people landed there.
Before you start the assessment, it's important to define the scope, and this is something that the OSC is the acronym for Organizations Seeking Certification. So this is you as the contractor that are getting a certification from a C3PAO. Is a requirement in the CMMC framework to establish the scope of the certification. And there's some latitude granted as to whether that's at the enterprise network or particular system segments, or even an isolated enclave that's designed for storing and processing either federal contract information or controlled unclassified information. Excluding and there's having a good understanding of that scope, meaning what parts of your organization and which particular systems are going to be included in the assessment, is something that's very important to have worked out with your C3PAO before you start down the assessment path. Certainly going to affect the scope, the effort, probably the cost of that assessment. It's also going to affect the nature of the certification that you receive. So the certifications are given at an enterprise level or organizational level, but they are for specific systems that have been certified. So it's important to look at all systems that might store or process, either currently or in the future, any federal contract information, controlled unclassified information, or any other information that would require CMMC types of controls. If you have systems that are not being assessed, those can be excluded, and the assessment will not look at them.
Yeah, and if I can jump in.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
This certainly is one of the most important pieces, I think, of the entire process. And we talked about kind of this assumption that proper readiness has already occurred. And this is something that really should be somewhat of a formality by the time you get to the assessment. I mean, you should have a defined boundary. You should understand what it is in terms of level of certification you are aspiring to achieve. And so that when you are meeting with the C3PAO, all of that stuff is buttoned up. And so from our perspective, we've been helping organizations for months. This is something that we do very early on with partnering with the folks that we're working with to get a handle on this, because as you mentioned, there's a cost consideration here. No reason to go level 3 if in fact you don't need to. And quite frankly, when you look at the exponential growth from 17 control requirements to 130 from just level 1 to level 3, you can kind of equate dollars and cents to that as well. So getting this in order so that by the time you are engaging with the C3PAO for an actual assessment, that it's formally documented, it's able to stand on its own, and you're able to describe and more accurately have documented the assessment type you were going after. Ed mentioned kind of entity versus enclave approach. There's actually a hybrid approach too, where you could get the entity done at level 1 and then an enclave in level 3, for example, if that made sense. So there's a couple different options there, and working with folks up front to get this ironed out is really going to save a lot of time, so that when the C3PAO, you do start engaging in talks with them, that you're better prepared for the actual audit. So just wanted to kind of reiterate that as well.
And one of the things that the assessors will be looking at during the assessment is, this is agreed upon up front, as Neal was describing, and then during the assessment, they're going to be looking to see, is that really the reality on the ground? Is there indication that you have effectively segregated your CUI and your FCI on those systems that are in scope, and there's not a chance of that data spilling over or being in other systems that are intended to be out of scope? So they will be verifying the boundary, verifying that they don't see indications that the information is not properly contained within those boundaries. So it's important to not only have them clearly defined, but also well enforced in terms of the way the system is designed, the way the policies are designed.
That's right.
Next, I want to talk about the assessment process a little bit. On the screen, we've got some estimates of the effort, the level of effort. And this will give an idea of the size and scope of the assessment and the kind of team that the assessor will bring. These are from the Department of Defense estimates that were published in a recent DFARS interim rule. They have in there these estimates for small business C3PAO assessments. So do keep in mind, and there's some caveats on the screen, but do keep in mind that these are designed only for small business. So if you are not in that category, if you're a mid-size or more complex business, you should expect a correspondingly higher estimate. I think it also assumes a relatively simple boundary. So Neal mentioned hybrid scenarios where you might have multiple systems at different levels. That sort of additional complexity could obviously take you away from this. And I'll also point out that these estimates are DoD estimates. These are not necessarily vetted by the marketplace. So as the marketplace will be open and competitive, and so you may see C3PAOs coming in with levels of effort that are higher or lower based on their approach for doing the assessment. But this is the expectation I think should give a good understanding of how you can expect that assessment to as you interact with it. So at level 1, it's a fairly short effort, 19 hours of assessment with a single assessor, so an assessment team of one person spending just one day on site. So fairly quick. We've heard the DoD talk about level 1 assessments as being relatively inexpensive, relatively quick and painless. And some of that is because of the limited number of controls. They need to look at only 17 controls, and they need to look at any maturity items. So it is much more limited. As we get to level 2 and higher, as you can see, the level ramps up pretty fast. So level 3 was our most popular for this audience. 72% of you said you're looking at level 3. So the estimate there is for 228 hours by a 4-person team that's on site for the better part of a week. So 4 or 5 days, depending on travel. So that's a fairly extensive effort. And we'll get into in a minute some of the evidence, some of the things that they'll do, some of the activities that'll be performed during that time. If you add up the hours on site times the 4 people, you'll see that it's less. So there is some preparatory work for some of the things Neal mentioned around getting the assessment plan ready, agreeing on scope and boundaries. And then, of course, after the on-site work, there's the work of putting together the assessment report and findings and making a report recommendation. Neal, anything else you want to mention in terms of how people should think of and interpret these estimates?
Yeah, no, I think you touched on it. I mean, from a consulting perspective, when we look at estimates kind of broadly across the board, I know they classify at least small business here. We tend to get a little nervous just because there's so many different variables. I mean, you talked about some. You could look at, even the environment itself, is it centralized versus decentralized? Do you have a lot of systems in the cloud where you could potentially inherit some of these requirements versus things being on-prem? The complexity of the systems, the number of locations and scope and so forth, a lot of these do play into it. So while these are good guidelines, certainly talking to folks, every single one of the several hundred suppliers that are on the webcast today, I'm sure are unique in their own regard. So I think these are good starting points, but then talking to folks makes sense. And Ed, we've had a couple questions come up in the chat. One of them that I was just going to address really quickly.
Sure.
That I think is relevant. Pete mentioned being audited by DCMA in February against NIST 800-171, high confidence on site, and they wanted to know kind of how closely that aligns to level 3. And the AB and really the DoD, for that matter, have all along said that level 3 is most closely aligned with 800-171. Not only do all of the 110 controls make up level 3 in addition to the 20 additional, but they also now, when you start looking at the guides, both level 1 and level 3 have been published as of the last few days. You can see the direct tie to 800-171A. So Pete, to your question, it absolutely aligns very closely. I know you mentioned in the chat that you did very well in that assessment. So the expectation there is that you would do very well for those 110. Certainly that delta of 20 controls you'd want to concentrate on, which I think you are doing. But to your question, it is a very, very close alignment between 800-171 and CMMC level 3. The primary difference for other folks on the call that may be thinking, we went through a NIST 800-171 assessment, or we had somebody come in and kick the tires, or we had a group internally do this, is the difference of this requirement of an external third party C3PAO, which is the actual assessment, versus the self-assessment, which we all know sometimes can lead to, oh yeah, we're going to get that done, we'll put it on a POA&M, and other priorities come up, or just maybe a little bit too gracious of self-scoring in certain situations, which obviously is not going to stand up once you have an actual C3PAO sitting on the other side of the table.
Yeah, if you had one of the DIBCAC assessments, like the audience members is asking about, performed by DCMA, that level of rigor and the type of evidence is in line with what the CMMC assessors are going to look for. So that same evidence should work. As the 110 controls, as you mentioned, Neal, they do align exactly. In other words, the wording is 100% the same. So in addition to the 20 additional controls, there are CMMC level 3. The other additional thing is the maturity level. So that's something that the DCMA assessor will not have looked at. So you'll need to make sure you have all those maturity level items in place. We'll talk on the next slide about some of those and what they do. Someone else asked. Go ahead, Neal.
The next slide, because there was one more question from Rich regarding timing, just before we get off the timing here.
Yep, I was going to go to that. Yeah, go for it. Yep.
Okay, I'm sorry. It was just, what is the estimated amount of time for a company to become compliant with only one IT person starting from scratch, taking into consideration that he or she is performing regular IT duties? And that's something I've touched on in previous panels with you, Ed, is the burden on internal resources. I mean, all of the folks that it's no different than any other assessment or audit. People do have their normal day jobs to contend with. So the question about the amount of time, there's a difference between what we're talking about on this slide, the amount of time for the actual assessment, versus what goes on before. And some of the previous webcasts that have been done by L3 and NeoSystems, highly encourage you to check those out on the NeoSMRT portal, have touched on this. But typically in one of the graphics on the AB's website, they're talking about starting to prepare 6 months in advance. And Rich, to your comment about only one IT person starting from scratch, when I hear starting from scratch, that leads me to believe that there's not a lot of formalization and documentation, and that's normal in smaller companies. You are worried about keeping the lights on, you're worried about keeping the servers up and running, and serving the mission critical activities versus documented policies and procedures. And you didn't indicate what level potentially you'd be looking at. There's a huge difference in what is required from level 1 to level 3, not only from a control requirements perspective, but also a formalization of documentation. And that can be an extremely heavy lift. There are some options out there, even packages that you can buy to, kind of give you a huge head start. But again, kind of figuring out, do I need to be level 1 versus level 3 is step number 1, figuring out the system boundary, step number 2, and then really preparing what you do not want to have. And we're going to jump into the assessment process. You don't want to have any questions hanging out there. You don't want to have any open-ended issues that are still yet to be resolved prior to starting the assessment. I mean, the thought is when you're ready to start an assessment, you're ready to ace the test.
There are these estimates that I have on the screen that talk about the cost for the C3PAO. The DFAR's interim rule does contain similar estimates for the contractor effort, meaning what do you need to do to get prepared? But I want to put a key caveat on there, which is that those estimates in that DFAR's rule assume you already implemented all 110 controls under NIST 800-171, because those controls are not new. They're under an older DFAR's requirement. So the starting point for their estimate is that you've already got that perfect score of 110, and you're just adding on the 20 new things and the maturity items and getting ready for the assessment, and it's still several hundred hours. So I think important to really give that the effort it needs. There aren't really any shortcuts in terms of the effort. So one person doing it as an additional duty may not be realistic to achieve level 3. I'll say you may want to look at the possibility of adding a partner that could come in and do some of that work to supplement that person, so that you don't suffer some operational deficiencies with them not doing their day job, if you will.
Yeah, and that's some of that partnering I mentioned that we're doing with our clients, is not only to assess the boundary and the overall environment and kind of applicability of different things, but looking at the use of third-party providers. Obviously, NeoSystems being one on here, and numerous third-party providers in typically any environment. Nobody's really doing anything by themselves. So where do those folks fall into play? Where does the CUI travel, as we had on a previous slide? That's where CMMC really looks at it, is it follows the data. So taking a look at that again up front and getting a handle on that will save a lot of time come time for the assessment.
One other quick note on the previous slide too, I forgot to mention, was right now the assessments are all conducted on site from level 1 all the way up to level 5. There is a requirement to be on site. There has been some discussion because of the fact that a lot of businesses have moved to either partially or fully remote work, because a lot of people have their data in the cloud or highly distributed operations. Where exactly is on site anymore? And so there's some rethink of that going on by the folks that are making these assessment standards, in terms of, are there ways to get to the evidence that they need without having to go to a site that may not at this point have very many people actually working at that site. So stay tuned for further developments as the COVID story and the migration of our workforce ensues. This next slide takes a look at CMMC assessment coverage and what's covered. So at level 1, the lighter boxes, just 5 areas: access control, media protection, identification, authentication, physical protection, and system information integrity. Oh, I forgot one: system and communications protections. So those are the items looked at on a level 1 assessment. There's 17 controls spread across those 6 domains. And then as we get to level 2, it adds in additional items, as well as the maturity items at the top begin at level 2. And then by the time we get to level 3, all of the domains are included. So then proceeding from above level 3 to level 4 and 5, there's no new domains, just additional, more strict requirements within those. So as Neal mentioned, that affects greatly the amount of effort and the scope of what the assessor's looking at as you change levels. Neal, do you want to talk a little bit about the coverage in the assessment sense?
In terms of the different levels, you mean, or?
Sure.
Yeah, so as Ed mentioned, you can see here kind of the different color coordination is when you start stacking on different domain areas and what that can mean to folks. One to point out is you see physical protection kind of being in that light blue, which is part of every level assessment. So to Ed's point earlier, they're still trying to nail down really this requirement for physically being on site to verify some of these things. And one of the reasons is because that physical protection domain is across all 5 of the maturity levels, for example. To be quite honest with you, with where we are now in the provisional period, from my perspective, ideally the provisional period provides a lot of insight as to what is good in theory versus execution. And hopefully some of that feedback makes its way back to the AB and the DoD, which is really the intent of this provisional period. So you may see some changes in terms of how future assessments may ultimately be conducted. But again, when you're talking level 1 from 17 controls versus level 3, when you have to have every single one of these domains documented and then resourced with a resource plan, including training and budget, that's where you're going to start to see a lot of the delta, and even to the attendee Rich's comment earlier about policies and procedures, and what needs to be in place from a single IT person. That's where you're going to see a lot of folks, in my opinion, stumble. Andy had put in the chat just while we're talking about policies and procedures, my comment about some organizations out there that have kind of prepackaged things to get you started. Certainly, Andy, any Google search is going to pop up 100 of them. And I know we're not endorsing anybody here, so please don't take this as an endorsement. Compliance Forge has been out there, in the market for quite some time. And there's others to be considered. When you're working with third parties yourself, sometimes they either have policies and procedures that can help get you there. So I would start with, quite frankly, what's free and available for you first, and see if there is anything available. And then there's plenty of folks out there, and just making sure that you're doing the proper vetting like you would with any vendor.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, NeoSystems, I'm not here to pitch our services, but we do include policies and such in all of our CMMC packages. Neal, you kind of we're heading towards the maturity level, which is the next slide. So maybe we dive right into that. So this starts at level 2 is where you need to start demonstrating maturity levels. So Neal, can you talk about what people would need to have ready for the assessment? This is the sort of the newest thing, right? So no previous assessment that the DoD has done, even the DCMA assessments that were talked about before, looked at maturity and how things were institutionalized. So this is something that's new from both the preparation perspective and the assessment perspective.
Yep. And so we'll focus obviously on, I don't think we had anybody in the original poll and that were interested in 4 and 5. And I know you guys, Ed, have dug in previously on some webcasts into 4 and 5. So we'll focus on maturity levels 1 through 3. And you can see here kind of this description of what needs to be done to meet the practices. So these 17 controls in maturity level 1, they have to be performed. They have to be implemented and demonstrated as such. However, you'll see that there's not an actual practice beyond that. There's not anything that says it has to be documented. That really comes into play in maturity level 2, which is really considered a transition between 1 and 3. And I think we had one attendee mention that they were currently looking at maturity level 2, which is somewhat of a stepping stone. It's thought to be one that is not going to be assumed to be anyway a contract requirement in RFPs, but rather one that OSCs can take as a stepping stone when moving from maturity level 1 to level 3. Kind of crawl before you walk perspective. But you can see this heavy documentation requirement, really establishing policies that include all those domains that were on the previous slides, as well as documenting the actual practices that meet those meet the requirements in each of the domains. So that, as I mentioned, can be quite a heavy lift for folks that do have their day jobs and aren't. Let's be honest with you, I consider myself somewhat of an IT person, and Ed too. I'm not knocking the group, but we're not known for overly, loving to document things. Whereas when you get to level 3, it brings in this managed component of maturity, and really kind of I talked about a little earlier is establishing, maintaining, and a resource plan. And again, this includes all of the domains. For at each one of those levels, you need to have a documented resource plan to the people, the budget, and the training aspect for each one of these. And those three kind of perform, document, and manage. They all build on each other. So you couldn't pass a level 3 without having things documented, and you couldn't pass a level 3 without obviously the controls being performed. So each one builds on another, and they're in aggregate with each other.
Very good. So next, I want to really dive into having the evidence ready. So that the key thing with having a third-party assessment that Neal alluded to earlier versus a self-assessment is the requirement to produce evidence that's obvious and acceptable to an independent third party that may not be knowledgeable of your system or your practices. So you need to have all the things that are happening easily accessible to the assessor so they can make their determination. So on the screen is some detail about the kind of things that assessors are looking at, what is being assessed, as well as some of the methods that they'll use, how they will assess it. And in the CMMC standard, there is a requirement that the assessor is looking for 2 pieces of corroborating evidence from 2 of those 3 assessment methods. So examine, interview, test. So the idea there is that not just one item showing that you're doing it is sufficient. You need to make sure there are 2, and they have to be from different methods. So this is something that the C3PO will determine as they do their assessment planning. So in some respect, you can be prepared by looking at each control and deciding how would I demonstrate that to an assessor, but ultimately it's going to be up to the assessor themselves to decide what methods they want to use and what objects they want to look at. So Neal, can you talk a little bit about how that works from the assessor perspective and how people can best prepare so that they have the right stuff ready before the assessor gets there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but that preparation piece being so important, gathering this information prior to even engaging the C3PO, because as Ed mentioned, the C3PO is going to determine which of these types of evidence they are going to require per control. And that's really going to be ironed out during the planning phase of the C3PO. So you want to have your bases covered. And when you look at these 3 different method areas, that's examine, interview, and test, down below you will see a requirement per control is that the C3PAO receives 2 independent pieces of evidence from 2 of those 3 areas. So they could examine something and test it. They could interview a person and then test. What they can't do is do 2 from the same to satisfy it. They couldn't interview 2 people and consider it passing, for example. So getting those ducks in a row from your readiness and kind of preparedness consulting that ideally folks are either have been doing or are planning to do is imperative to setting yourself up for success for the audit. The ability to say, hey, we've got all 3 of these across, the 17 controls for a level 1. Pick your poison, whatever you want, we've got it, is fantastic. The likelihood of being able to do that at level 3 as you get more mature, obviously, is a larger undertaking, but something that ideally you are well positioned by the time you are having talks with the C3PAO and engaging with them, because this will be a requirement.
Maybe you could talk a little bit to track record. I mean, the idea that, because you need to assess maturity, the fact that someone couldn't say, hey, I instituted this policy yesterday, and so therefore I think I should pass because I have this brand new policy that I've just published. If they haven't actually shown evidence of implementing and using that policy over a period of time, how does that affect the assessment process?
Yeah, and there's still some thought, anybody that's been through other assessments, certifications, or attestations that cover audit periods or assessment periods, there's still some thought at what that needs to be. And Ed, to your point, any assessor that would come in would be fairly nervous if the ink was still wet on everything that they were looking at and seeing changes being made, prior to or during the assessment itself. So there is going to have to be some evidence there. That the control was, and again, it depends on the maturity level you're going after, but that the control was performed and then documented and/or managed. And one of the pieces, and I think we have a slide about this a little later on, is this documented and managed piece. So to be quite honest with you, from a consultant and I don't like the term auditor, but I guess I'm an auditor as well. But from an auditor's perspective, policies and procedures, I mean, in my mind, I would always rather the control be evidence to have been implemented and being followed versus a piece of paper. The piece of paper to me was always kind of secondary. Now, there's also the thought if it's not documented, it's not done. and CMMC takes that to the next level. So for level 3, I mean, an automatic failure for level 3 is if you do not have documented policies and procedures up to the level of rigor that CMMC level 3 requires. And that's interesting. Most often with me, from a consulting and an auditor's perspective, it'd be like, oh, okay, you don't have it formally documented, but I can see here that it's being done consistently, and it's being done correctly. Let's go ahead and get that documented. That's not going to be one of those ones that will be acceptable during the 90-day period. And I know we're going to jump into that, so I'm getting a little bit ahead, Ed. But to your point, yeah, the expectation from an assessor's perspective is that things need to be evidenced to have been in place, not something that was just scrambled and pulled together for an assessment's sake.
Preparation is key. Neal, can you walk us through this one example on the screen, just one requirement out of the 130 at level 3? It says protect wireless access using authentication and encryption. So very benign sounding requirement. Tell me how you would break this down as an assessor and what you would expect to see on the ground.
Yeah, no, so a couple things. One, I'd want to know if it's applicable or not. And something like wireless is one of those things, anybody that's been through any NIST assessment previously, whether it be FedRAMP or FSMA or any NIST-based, even 800, 171, they know that NIST isn't overly fond of not applicable as an answer. And certainly if it is not applicable, it needs to be documented as such as to why. So if you think about something with wireless, if folks say, oh, we don't use wireless, we don't have wireless in our environment, that's not going to be, okay, cool, we'll move on to the next one. That's going to need to be vetted in some regard. But assuming it is applicable, when you look at something like this and you've got kind of two sub requirements here, that the system is protected using authentication, we're going to need to look at credentials and so forth. And then versus the second, this wireless access to the system is protected using encryption. What type of encryption are you using? Is it WEP, WP, WPA, WPA2, and so forth, and really getting into the actual configuration settings. So if you think about testing for things of that regard, you can see what they've done here, and what they do in the guides is they do provide examples of what can be examined, what can be tested, and who potentially could be interviewed. And to the gentleman's point earlier, there's only one IT person. You can see probably several different types of IT people listed here, where it's like, well, we really only have one IT person. So the likelihood of that person being used for interviews over and over again is highly likely. The other thing I would like people to take away is you can use a piece of evidence more than once. So if you have an access control policy that is addressing wireless, there's no reason why you can't then turn around and use the same access control policy for another access control, maybe around passwords or user authentication and setting up and deleting users and so forth. So it's not like you can only use a piece of evidence one time. It just needs to be applicable. And then in this example, again, you'd have to select two independent pieces of evidence from two of these three categories.
So a question for the audience just came in and said, if a practice has two aspects, this and that, which our example does, has two, A and B there, does that mean you need 4 forms of evidence? And I guess the answer would be if an evidence could potentially cover both this and that, right, in one evidence, but if they're not, then yeah, you need to have 4 pieces, right? You need to have 2 for each of the components of the requirement.
Yeah, no, Larry, that's exactly what I was just mentioning. Your question probably came through at the same time, as if you had a policy that addressed how authentication is granted, taken away, and so forth for wireless access versus the requirement for encryption. That policy could be used to satisfy each one of those.
So Neal, I've got 3 slides coming up here, which are kind of what to expect on the ground, the kind of walkthrough of the assessment process. So Neal, maybe you could take us on a fairly quick spin. We do want to have some time at the end for some questions, but this will be the sort of logistics of the assessment team planning and arriving and conducting the assessment. So run us through, and I'll keep up on the slides.
Yep, and I'm going to try and go as quick as I can. Let me address a question that came through from Steve regarding the requirement for the basic self-assessment, and just want to clarify that's different than what we're talking about here. That self-assessment, in order to enter in a score of 110 or less into the SPRS, is a separate requirement than CMMC, and that is for those that were subjected to DFAR 7012. It does require that self-assessment. You probably are wondering about the due date because you saw a lot of requirements for November 30th, which, to be quite honest with you, a lot of primes were asking their subs to comply by November 30th. And the reason is because that requirement could potentially come in any contract starting now, basically starting a week ago, moving forward. So different than what we're talking about here, Steve, but you are right, that is a self-assessment requirement. You basically start with 110 and you deduct if you do not meet requirement outright. And it is a self-assessment score that you put up into that SPRS system with company information, your cage code, and your actual score. And there's some kind of fallout from that in terms of where you fall score-wise, and then obviously applicability to potential awards of contracts. So we can follow up after this with through NeoSystems and L3 with the information that's been provided on how to conduct those, and even steps on how to submit that information up to the SPRS, because I know there's still a little bit of confusion about that. But I just wanted to touch on that before getting into these assessments, which is really more about the CMMC. So really setting up the assessment plan. So there's a lot of required documents, intake forms, and so forth that really need to be approved by the AB before the actual assessments can start. So there's a lot of formality around this, and you look at the assessment plan, really setting up those member roles and responsibilities. And some of those are going to be, okay, we only have one IT person. That's going to be your key point of contact, and we'll team that with other folks from the organization. And then with obviously larger organizations, more complex systems, you could have network admins, you could have system owners and so forth, control owners down to that level. And then setting up an interview and testing schedule. There's a lot of formality that CMMC is really hoping comes into play with these assessments, and really kind of hammering down interview and testing schedule in terms of who we're going to be meeting with and when that testing will occur. And then, as we mentioned earlier, those evidence requirements, what we as the C3PAO are going to expect to see. And so is it somewhat giving you the answers to the test before you take it? I could see it looked at a little bit that way, but the amount of turnaround time, again, the assumption is that you guys have all this already because you've done proper readiness. One of the things they've been pretty clear about with this on-site requirement, which again, as Ed mentioned, is still a little in limbo with COVID and some other things, is assuming that the on-sites are happening, that you have to provide a space for the assessment team to conduct interviews. You have to give them the ability to walk the premises, whether or not they have to be escorted or not, obviously up to you. And the assumption is you probably should be escorting folks. And then you have to have access to the control owners, the folks that know this information. And those are kind of project assumptions, if you will. And then I talked earlier about site visits being necessary to validate controls from the physical protection domain, and that they are included across all levels. The other kind of formality that they mentioned are these daily debriefs that are required to be documented between the C3PAO and then the OSC, which is organizations seeking certifications, really the government contractors typically, and their point of contact. Certainly other people can be involved in these daily debriefs, but that's kind of the requirement at a minimum. Reporting is really conducted offsite after testing is complete. The idea in a perfect world, and we're obviously not in a perfect world at the moment, hopefully before not too long we can get back to kind of normalcy in these audits, or these assessments rather. But the idea being that the planning is conducted, you go on site, perform all your testing. You as a C3PAO are not actually required, but you're not supposed to take CUI off site. Everything is supposed to be done, be it shoulder surfing or within the confines of the OSC. And then when you leave, you have all your documentation and you complete the reporting. The remediation, which I know we're going to delve into a little bit more detail, we're going to fly through this as quick as we can. If there is remediation that's needed, OSCs have 90 days. And you see here for minor issues that prevented certification, this is up to the C3PAO. This is completely their call. And they must agree, as we said here, that the issues are of a nature that can qualify for remediation. It can't be blatant gaps. It can't be, as I mentioned, even the policy and procedure when you start talking about level 3, for example, that I touched on earlier. Those aren't going to be things that you can't go in and just fail miserably and scramble over 90 days and get certified. These are going to be up to the C3PAO at their discretion. And they may need to return to test if need be for some of those.
So there's an audience question about, do you expect people will be fined for non-compliance after the 90-day if they fail to comply? And the answer is, if you don't get CMMC, I don't know about fines, but the penalty is that you can't receive a warrant of a contract.
Yeah.
So you basically can't work on the contract anymore.
That's right.
So it's kind of the ultimate fine in that sense. It costs you your business. All right, sorry, interrupt your flow here.
So again, and we're going to bounce back on some of these, but once the report and package has been submitted to the C3PO, we conduct a QA review of the report and evidence, any remediation efforts that's done, and then it really goes to the actual AB for their independent quality assurance review and potential certification. So us as the C3PAO, we package everything up with a bow, give it to the C3PAO, give it to the CMMCAB with our recommendation. If our recommendation is to certify at a given level and the AB agrees, they issue the certification, as Ed mentioned, is valid for 3 years. If our recommendation is not to certify and the AB agrees with us, they will not take the next steps to perform a detailed review of the report unless, and we're going to circle back on this, unless the OSC files a dispute. So that's now the other question I've gotten on this, I don't see it coming across in the chat, is okay, what happens if we go after level 3 and we missed the mark on level 3, but we've made we've met every mark for level 2. The recommendation from the C3PAO could be we are not recommending them for level 3, but we are recommending them for level 2. Okay, so let's talk about, back up a little bit, if there are findings. So what happens when findings are discovered? Really, if they are, then the C3PAO, so many acronyms, C3PAO is really responsible for bubbling those up and communicating them. They're typically done as part of the daily debriefs, those status reports by the C3PAO when they're, quote, on site doing their detailed testing. But what you'll see here is we are not, as the C3PAO, allowed to provide remediation efforts, design of remediation, to say you failed this control, this is what you need to do in order to pass it, because that would be considered consulting and then would violate independence. And then, we have a comment here about on-the-spot fixes, generally not allowed for maturity items, such as documented policies that we talked about. However, at the discretion of the C3PAO, there may be times where you are permitted 90 days to fix any of those kind of more minor deficiencies.
Thanks, okay. Thanks, Neal. Next topic is about the POA&M, and there's been a lot sort of mixed signals around plan of action and milestones with CMMC, and the common discussion is POA&Ms are going away, but not entirely true. They're really just changing flavor. I think in the past, one of the concerns was that people would have a plan of action and milestones where they had never really implemented the requirement at all, and they would use the POA&M potentially for an indefinite period of time as a de facto waiver of the control, and that's what's going away. So under CMMC, starting with level 2 and levels 2 and higher, you are required to have a POA&M. You're required to maintain one and keep track of any deficiencies of your system as they may reoccur from time to time using that POA&M process. But, and this is the key caveat, at the time of your assessment, all the practices and processes must be implemented. So you can no longer use the POA&M as a de facto waiver. You have to have 100% of the policy practices and processes implemented and ready to be assessed in the manner that Neal described. If you had some POA&M items as you were getting ready, you may have had those on your POA&M and they would need to be closed prior to the assessment. If you have after the assessment and you're in your 3-year period of the certification, you have things that crop up, something breaks, needs to be upgraded, need to change technologies, need to adapt to the threat. Any of those kind of adjustments to your security program would be typically put on and tracked in the POA&M in accordance with that requirement. The other piece that is part of this discussion is the idea of an alternative implementation, something you do that doesn't exactly meet what the standard says. So Neal, do you want to talk a little bit about that in terms of what assessors can and cannot accept with respect to people who have things that are a little bit sideways to the language of the standard?
Yeah, and I know you and I have talked about this offline as well as on panels previously. So kind of this thought of alternate implementations, is that what you're referring to?
Yep.
where does that fall? In a lot of it is going to be subjected to the C3PAOs to their discretion as to whether or not the control requirement is met outright. You've heard the term pass-fail consistently used by Katie Arrington and others over the past year plus about CMMC, and really the thought being that you pass or you fail. You either meet the mark or you don't. So alternative implementations, I think, are going to be one-off situations. And again, that's something that really should be addressed upfront, not only during the readiness piece, but also during the planning with the C3PAO. While going through those evidence types and while going through what happens to be not applicable for you, I would highly encourage the conversations to be had about what potentially could be perceived as alternative implementations. So upfront, so that it doesn't end up being in the 11th hour that C3PAO says, no, this doesn't meet the mark. So having those conversations up front makes sense. We're not, as we have here, not risk acceptance authorities, and there is some thought that other NIST-based standards have that risk assessment ability to kind of accept risk and move on and with alternative implementations. But getting that out of the way up front is really going to save a lot of time and headaches towards the end when you think that you are meeting the letter of the law, but apparently it's not up to kind of the gospel of the AB and what they put forth in the maturity level standards.
Next topic is just, I'm going to gloss over this very briefly in the interest of time, just to say that if you do have a dispute with your assessor, if you disagree with their interpretation of the requirements or you disagree with the processes they're using, the CMMC Accreditation Body does have a formal process. You can see some of the details here on the screen, or you can get some of those details from their websites. But there are some procedures for getting the CMMC to adjudicate any of those disputes that may occur, since obviously those are commercial interactions. They may not always be 100% smooth. And then so the last slide in terms of content here is after the assessment, what what you should be doing if the assessment was favorable. So as Neal mentioned, the certification will be issued by the AB for 3 years. Please don't forget, as you get that new status, to update that in the NeoSMRT portal. I have a slide coming up. I'm going to show you how to get access to that if you don't already, but report that to L3Harris using the portal. And then, of course, after certification, it's important that you do all the continuous monitoring activities that you will have demonstrated to in the assessment. It's important that you continue those. At levels 2 and above, there is requirement you periodically assess your security controls to make sure they remain effective. So even though you don't need to bring an independent third party in for 3 years, you have to still do the maintenance of that and making sure that that's kept current. And I would assume when we get out far enough that we're looking at second round, 3 years out, looking at second round of certification, then the assessors are going to be looking for that that track record. The only time in that 3-year period that you will need to bring in a new third-party assessment is if you decide to change levels. If you say you were certified at level 1 and now you want to go to level 3, of course, that's going to require a new visit by a C3PAO. Neal, anything you want to add before we wrap things up here today and go to questions?
No, and I apologize for having to move so quick over the last few slides. Obviously, a lot of information, hopefully valuable for the folks that are attending. One of the things from the dispute and resolution process, just know that there are avenues. So from the OSC's perspective, you do have 14 days from completion of the assessment to essentially file a dispute. And there's a number of different reasons that you can do that. And what happens there is that the CMC, the AB, independently does their own review to say, okay, do we agree? Should a new assessment be done? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, you can actually file another dispute, in which case they will send one of their own out to conduct a full-blown assessment. Or if they do agree that the dispute is valid, they reserve the right to do that as well. So just know that it's not the end-all be-all. There is an independent party, and that's specifically put in place for that reason, for dispute and resolution purposes.
Great. I do want to give a quick emphasis on the NeoSMRT portal to report your status, your progress towards CMMC certification, to L3Harris. So this portal is both a resource for you in terms of getting access to educational materials, the on-demand replays of these webinars, answers to questions, etc., as well as a way for you to report your status to L3Harris. If you don't have an account, if you've not received an invitation, and you're an L3Harris supplier, please look at the email on the bottom of the screen, cybersecurity_SC, as in supply chain, cybersecurity_SC at L3Harris.com, and request an invitation, and we'll get you connected up. And then once you are logged in, you can go to this readiness status option. And that's where you can report your progress. You can report your progress towards CMMC certification. And it's just a quick 6-step process you need to fill out. It's not a detailed assessment there, just a few questions that will have L3Harris knowledgeable of how you're progressing forward. I'm going to skip ahead to the Q&A. We've got, I think, just one question from our audience, and we'll ask the producers to put up the final polling question. Let's take a quick polling question. If you have questions, please submit those. And I'm going to put this question out for L3Harris to answer. Let me stop the screen share. So this question says, we are an L3 supplier. Is there someone at L3 that would help us determine what documents we create that should be considered CUI? Is L3 trying to limit flow down of CUI data? So someone want to take that from the L3 side?
So Ed, this is Joseph Polvino. I'll take this question for L3Harris. I'll start with the easier of the two answers, which is yes, L3Harris is trying to limit the flow down of CUI data. I think most suppliers and primes you will find are doing that, not only to make it easier on our suppliers, but also just limit the data that is out there and available. Regarding someone to help determine what documents are CUI, besides using the official websites, the NARA marking guidelines, the NARA determination, if you want to reach out to your procurement agent or your program engineers and IPTs, they can assist you in working out what the documents are supporting L3Harris programs that would most likely be marked as CUI.
Very good. I don't see the polling answers coming back yet, but hopefully they'll pop up here shortly and we can relay some of that. Just getting a partial, so I'll let those come in. I don't see any other requirements, or excuse me, any other questions yet from the audience that we haven't already answered. We did answer quite a few on the fly. So polling question answers, 38% of folks said that they're currently in the process of understanding the requirements. 19% said they're filling the gaps in their controls. 27% said working on documentation, which, as listened to from Neal today, very important to have the documentation in order well in advance. And then 15% saying they're preparing for the audit assessment. So it seems like it's spread out quite a bit in terms of where people are. As we discussed, there's nobody doing these assessments today, right? So the marketplace is just coming together. The initial assessments will be folks that are on the Pathfinder contracts. So as those are announced, if you're on that, that will certainly accelerate you into the first wave, the first half of 2021. But for the rest of folks, I think folks that are in the understanding the requirements and filling the gaps, probably the right place to be, targeting assessment, in the 6 to 12 months or potentially even longer, depending on which contracts you're at. I do see one other question that came in. We're running over, but I will take a time to answer it if we can here. The question is, we have multiple physical locations. Would we need to have a separate assessment at each site? Specifically, would the assessors need to physically travel to each site? Neal, do you want to take that?
It's like they're reading our minds, huh, Ed?
Maybe.
We've talked about this within the last 24 hours, and certainly, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be variables to all of the different OSCs out there. And I don't think the expectation is going to be that every single site is going to have to be assessment is going to have to be conducted at every single site on site. I do think a sampling approach is probably where the assessments are going to settle on that.
I want to thank everyone for your time and attention today. I hope this was of value. If you have coworkers, colleagues who would like to view this material, please direct them to the on-demand items on the NeoSMRT portal. Again, if you have people who need to have access to that, you can email the email we produced before and get access to the NeoSMRT portal for anyone who needs it. Want to thank Neal Beggan from Cherry Bekaert for co-presenting with me today, and want to thank folks at L3Harris, Jeff, and Joseph for participating in the Q&A session today. Thank you very much.